I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, and Haudenosaunee indigenous people on which the University of Toronto now stands and on which I am today. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Poon Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederation and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resource. We discuss global health and ecology. We reflect on the colonialism and broken treaties, genocide, state-sanctioned oppression, violence, racism, and injustices perpetrated against indigenous people over hundreds of years and ongoing today. We reflect on the forced displacement of indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, both past and present. Let us be honest about our complicity in upholding the status quo, which perpetuates violence and exclusion. And let us honor our responsibility to change at the individual, institutional, and systemic level. So I would like to start maybe mentioning or giving you some information about my interest and how I came to work on issues of climate change, the ecological crisis, and migration slash displacement. I have a long-term interest in migration, perhaps because I am myself a serial migrant, and I always find it a bit difficult to answer the question where I'm from. Both my master's thesis and PhD dissertation were focusing on migration and health, and I work on the issue since my early 20s, working with the Roma population back in Italy, where I'm from. Reflecting on the experience of migration brought me to reflect on the relationship humans have with the land. Perhaps because the very first thing that migrants lose is that connection, the connection with the land. Land intended as Mother Earth or Pachamama, as local land, and land as identity, culture, and traditions. And reflecting on this relationship means reflecting on the relationship we have with nature. Our Western cultures are deeply influenced by the dogma of capitalism, by the history of colonialism, and by a worldview shaped by the industrial and technological revolutions. And I will say a few more words about this later. See nature as an assemblage of resources that can be extracted and transformed instead of as a mother we all belong to and cannot make without. Land as a unifying theme is important. Indigenous knowledge puts land at the very center everywhere. And alternative interpretations of development are important and are definitely part of the conversation about solutions to the crisis that we are facing today. And this path, the path I have been describing, cannot lead us in any other direction but to exploring and trying to better understand the ecological crisis we are facing as a species, a crisis that is 100%, a crisis that is 100% the result of the dominant set of values that so deeply influence our psyche and of the collective choices we make, or at least that a tiny minority of the global population makes. This is, for me, however, a new area of work. I'm not at all an expert or a specialist in this, and I have definitely many more questions than answers. So for me, even a presentation like this one is actually a really good opportunity to learn from all of you. I have learned quite a bit about these issues by designing and teaching courses on global migration and health, and climate change and migration displacement at both the senior undergraduate and graduate levels. And what from my students, I have learned a lot, but I have learned two things essentially. First, how much interest there is and they have in these issues. And of course, climate change touches all of us, but for the vast majority of them, migration is often directly related to their personal and family history. And second, and that this is something that really shocked me a bit, how little they know about them. In most cases, my courses are the first opportunity for them to explore in more depth this phenomena. And these are fourth-year undergraduate and graduate students living today in Toronto. It is a bit shocking, I have to say. So starting from a reflection on global migration, I really see migration as one of the phenomena that truly define our time. A phenomenon that is only going to increase unless the fundamental mechanisms of domination at work in today's world are radically changed. Almost every book, article, or documentary discussing migration starts with something like human beings have migrated since the early days of the history of their history. Actually, I have noticed over the years that the entire field of migration studies tends to be quite repetitive when it comes to formula like this one. However, I like the distinction between human mobility and migration made by Nicholas de Genova in 2017. If there were no borders, there would be no migration, only mobility. Borders, so powerfully discussed by Harsha Walia in her books Undoing Border Imperialism and the recent one, Border and Rule, and other mechanisms analyzed, among others, by Saskia Sassen in her 2014 book, Expulsions, produce at the same time crises of displacement and of immobility. As Walia writes, it is not migration that produces a crisis at the border. Instead, migration is the outcome of mechanisms that produce displacement, while at the very same time, borders create a crisis of immobility. One of the aspects in the literature about migration that I have been noticing for a long time and always criticized is the emphasis given to the right to move. In comparison, very little has been written about the right to stay. People should not be forced to leave their land, families, communities, and cultures to find work and means of survival elsewhere. Reflecting on this crisis and this right, and also because of my many years of work in global health, I make an effort to analyze migration in truly global terms. Most of the work done in Canada on migration and health is actually on immigration and health, particularly focusing on important issues like access to health services, integration, mental health, and so on. And these are definitely important topics of research, but they are not the entire picture. So what about the impact that out-migration has on countries of origin? Why do we talk so little about it? This is why I've been studying fractured families. This term, instead of other terms used in the literature like transnational families, for example, it's a preferred term for me for many reasons, but in particular because it emphasizes the structural violence at the root of the phenomenon. And it's interesting to observe like crises at the US-Mexican border during the Trump administration were very visible. And at least for a few weeks, we followed with attention the story of families who were separated at the border. And by the way, it's really important to remember that a fairly large number of those children still haven't been reunited with their families. But there is an ongoing global crisis that is almost invisible, at least to the general public. A crisis of families and communities that are separated because of out-migration that is not an option essentially, but almost in many cases a necessity. And just to give you a few numbers, like in China, there are probably more than 100 million children left behind in rural areas by their parents who have to move to cities to work in factories. In the Philippines, 1/4 of the entire population under 18 grows without at least one parent. In Mexico, the out-migration is the first cause of absence of a parent from the household. And Canada is definitely part of this problem. As I'm sure many of you know, every year we attract tens of thousands of temporary agricultural migrant workers. Here in Ontario, most of them come from Mexico and the Caribbean. They work here for 6, 8, 10 months a year, often for decades away from their families. And that's definitely can be definitely seen as our contribution to the problem of fractured families. I have currently a small SHIRK grant that explores the experience of separation from family, community, and cultures between living caregivers in Toronto from the Philippines and young Indigenous people who have to move to a large city to study or to find jobs. And of course, the two population groups are very different, but the historical and present times drivers or factors that result in their need to move are almost identical. So what I would like to do in my presentation of today, I would like to offer you a very brief, and I have to necessarily be quite superficial because of the complexity of this issue, but a very general introduction to the magnitude and characteristics of contemporary global migration, an equally brief introduction to the impact that one of the components of the current ecological crisis, that is climate change, has on migration and displacement, some reflection on key aspects in the links between the two phenomena that I have observed through my work, and mentioning very, very briefly a few initiatives I am currently involved in. So when I talk about ecological crisis, of course, I consider, or I take into consideration the multiple dimensions of this crisis, of which climate change is only one, but to which we can add loss of biodiversity, resource depletion, antimicrobial resistance, and risk of nuclear conflict. And I guess the events of the last 3 weeks show that the risk of nuclear conflict is a bit different from the other crises because it's sort of a 0-1 kind of risk, but it is definitely always there in the background. And many others would probably have, they would probably suggest a different list of dimensions. But what I see in this is that they are all truly existential crises, that they are all interrelated and that they are all man-made. About migration, I really like this image for various reasons. It is taken from the website of Paul Salopek, who is an American Pulitzer Prize winner journalist, who in 2013 started the journey on food, following exactly the route that humans follow according to most theories to colonize the planet. It is a project supported by National Geographic, and 9 years later, he is currently crossing China. So it will take him a bit to get to the end. And of course, there are many theories regarding time and direction of the initial movements of humans that led to the colonization of the planet. And I will obviously not get into details, but I find two things particularly interesting. If we appeared on the planet between 200 and 300,000 years ago, as most theories suggest, then we spent at least 3/4 of this time in Africa. And also, while the persistent Eurocentrism that has dominated the past 5 centuries of colonial history has given Europe the name of Old Continent, looking at this map, we realize that Europe was actually colonized later than most of Asia and Australasia, or Australia and New Zealand. So the history of migration is definitely a history of myths, many of which can be fairly easily debunked. And talking about myth that can be debunked, this image can show a few additional ones. Most of the history of large human migration movements over the past few centuries has been dominated by Europeans leaving Europe, and not by racialized migrants invading Europe, North America, and Australia, as the often presented like. Many of the people leaving Europe were displaced by factors that are quite similar to those that continue to displace people today. The integration of local traditional agrarian economies into a larger economy, the concentration of land in the hands of few, and the need for cheap labor in the colonies and in urban centers to support the Industrial Revolution. So the green arrow, of course, is movements of Europeans. The other two main arrows are also related to colonial expansion. The purple one, of course, shows the forced relocalization of Africans to the Americas as slaves, without which most of today's Western economic dominance would not have been possible. And the red one shows the movement of indentured workers, cheap labor in conditions of semi-slavery, moved from one corner of the British Empire to another, mainly. Once again, I like this diagram because it is a very simple in its essential structure and complex in terms of meaning, a way of describing in essential terms the roots of both the migration displacement phenomenon, as we have seen it over the past 5 centuries, and of the ecological crisis that we are facing. This model has been developed by Professor Rupa Maria, who is a physician and associate professor of medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and who works on decolonizing health systems. And she will actually be presenting in Toronto very soon in May as part of a series of lectures on land, borders, and health that I've been organizing with a small group of colleagues. Today's world, our worldview, our epistemology are profoundly shaped by 2 major historical phenomena: colonialism and the technological and industrial revolutions. Think about this: the entire global system of power that we see today is a direct result of the colonial expansion of European countries first, and of some of the colonies, like the US in particular, later on. Everything we see around us geopolitically has been shaped by this. Similarly, the entire Western way of knowing, or epistemology, has been shaped by a blind belief in technology and science. We talk a lot recently about indigenous ways of knowing, but we don't really believe they can truly contribute to our way of understanding reality and solving problems. the same wall that we hit when we talk about reconciliation without talking about restitution, that same wall we hit when we talk about indigenous ways of knowing without considering what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls epistemicide, or the negation of any alternative way of knowing. He writes that there is no social justice without epistemic justice. And I agree with him, because negating alternative ways of knowing equates to erasing the people whose very existence is based on them. These two phenomena have resulted, on the one hand, in multiple forms of supremacism or hierarchies of violence, and on the other, in the myth of endless economic growth, a myth that is so central to the challenges we are facing today. These forms of supremacism include both the hierarchical order based on race that has been fundamental in the history of colonialism, that continues today, and that shapes our way of understanding migration. The more I teach courses about migration, and the more I realize, I feel that I'm actually teaching courses about racism. And the hierarchical order that sees humans, and white men in particular, at the top and nature at the bottom, as an assemblage of resources and a primordial, amorphous, savage world to be civilized, with non-whites and women somewhere in between. So, very briefly, what are the dimensions of contemporary migration? These statistics are from IOM and UNHCR, very crudely corrected by myself for the Ukrainian crisis that we are witnessing today. And these are the numbers that usually are mentioned when discussing migration and displacement. A few points are worth emphasizing here. First, all of these statistics are significantly used to show that migration is not as significant as sometimes popular media want us to believe. However, it is also important to consider that the world population is growing very quickly, and therefore numerically that percentage is increasingly meaningful. And also, we will see in a second, these numbers do not reflect the entire magnitude of the migration displacement phenomenon. And third, of those almost 30 million legally recognized refugees, more than 85% live in the global south or in low and middle income countries. So let's forget just another myth, the generosity of the West. We have always been very, very good at helping, inverted commas, those we need, and very bad at helping those who need us. And here, in red, you see that the first half of the slide is not the full story. The numbers in red are also significantly underestimated, but should always be added to the picture to get a more realistic understanding of the phenomenon. Apart from the fact that these statistics are difficult to estimate, I suspect that they are often discounted because the global North perspective on migration strongly prioritizes those aspects of the phenomenon that touch us directly. That is essentially long-distance, south-north international migration. Everything else does not matter, or at least gets significantly underestimated or discounted. So I would like to very briefly go back to some of the drivers of migration. And at the beginning of my courses, if I ask my students why people migrate, they answer the way we all would generically answer, right? It's conflict, poverty, persecution. Sometimes there is a bit of confusion between migrants and refugees, etc. But it is actually not these exceptional, let's call them, events that are the main drivers of migration. Today, the overwhelming majority of migrants are instead displaced by the physiological, everyday working of the global economy. The forced inclusion of local, traditional, and subsistence economies into the globalized economy, a process known as modernization, results in the expulsion of people, local villages, and rural economies, the vulnerable and marginalized from land. Land grabbing, that is the acquisition by foreign governments and private investors of hundreds of million hectares of land, for the most part, but not only in the global south, land that is then used to grow industrial and cash crops and to gain access to water and mining resources, compound the effects of modernization. The current phase of capitalism is one in which land and natural resources in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia, for example, are more important than the people who live on those lands, as Sassen suggests. Monocultures replace traditional food crops, produce new hunger, displace a local flora and fauna, and most often contaminate land and water. In the long term, it is dead land that is left. Rural migrants, whether indigenous or not, move to city slums, and many of them sooner or later join the international migration fluxes. Observed from this perspective, migration becomes, therefore, a pathological byproduct of development. The causal web of displacement blurs the traditional legal boundaries between a refugee and a migrant, or economic migrant, as these people are often called. In fact, moving across borders is rarely an issue of free choice. What about the impact that migration has on health? Very briefly, again, in most cases, we tend to emphasize the direct impact that migration has on human health. The most common models structure such link in very rigid and linear terms, so pre, during, post-resettlement. They also tend to look at the phenomenon from the perspective of receiving countries and focus mainly on those who move. While the resettlement process is indeed extremely important, just think about living in refugee camps, the dangers related to crossing borders, the cultural shock, social displacement, and other phenomena experienced by migrants and the effect that they have on health. There is much more there. And obviously, I could talk for a long time about this, but just two brief reflections. First, migrants are not just migrants. Their intersectional identity has a significant impact on health. Migrants are men or women or sexual and gender minorities. They are children or adults or elderly. They are white or non-white. They are indigenous or non-indigenous. Settlement or not, they are wealthy or extremely poor, they are well educated or not, etc., etc. All of these factors intersect with their being migrant to significantly impact their health status. And second, the social cost of migration and related impact on health are not paid only by those who move, but also by those left behind, as I was mentioning earlier, families, entire communities, societies, entire countries, and at least by some sectors of societies in countries of resettlement. So is climate change impacting migration? Well, the answer in this case is quite simple. Yes, beyond any doubt. Climate change is already affecting every inhabited region of the globe, altering the severity and frequency of rapid onset weather events, extreme storms, heavy precipitations, floods, heat waves, and severe drought. It is also shaping slow onset hazards such as sea level rise, soil and drinking water salinization due to the frequent saltwater intrusions, reduced viability of crops, ocean acidification and deoxygenation, desertification, loss of biodiversity, species extinction, and whole ecosystem disruption, phenomena that are for the most part difficult or even impossible to reverse. And this is very important. Recent studies suggest that the impact of anthropogenic climate change may already be felt across 80% of the world's land area, where 85% of the population reside, according to Callaghan and colleagues in a paper published in 2021. It is also important to remember that the mid-latitudes will be impacted more by climate change than low latitudes. In Canada, for example, temperatures in the north increase more rapidly than at lower latitudes. This is important because often climate change has been presented as sort of a faraway problem impacting the tropics and small Pacific islands, for example. And it is definitely not the case. Migration and displacement are very important facets of this impact. So how can we bring together climate change, migration, and health? Often climate change impacts human health in very direct ways, such as when rapid or slow onset hazards result in injuries and death. In other cases, however, the effects of changes in the epidemiological patterns of vector-borne diseases, due to changes in mean temperatures, increased levels of air pollution due to wildfires, for example, or diminishing availability of food and water. Finally, climate change impacts human health, and this is the level that we discuss the least. It impacts human health through complex interactions with the cultural, social, economic, and political milieu in which it takes effect. And at this level, climate change acts as a true risk multiplier, compounding the effects of pre-existing social and political determinants of health. And it is important to emphasize that human mobility is an example of the many structural mediators linking climate change to health. By impacting the global distribution of resources, including food, water, and economic opportunities, climate change does and will increasingly affect both people's needs to move and their ability to do so. Migration, in turn, interacts with several other upstream determinants of health, such as conflict, for example, and affects human health in a multiplicity of ways, as we have seen. Climate-related mobility is not a new phenomenon. Climate has always shaped the geographic distribution of human population, and there is no reason to believe that climate change would represent an exception. What is new, however, are the relative rapid rates of change of environmental conditions that we are currently observing. The fact that these changes are not natural, well, they are natural if we consider that whatever we do as natural beings is natural, but they are not natural, but predominantly anthropogenic, so the result of human activities and the magnitude and complexity of the mobility fluxes that they could promote. Even if the causation link between environmental stress and the movement of people is never a simple straight line, climate change is undoubtedly already shifting patterns of mobility and will increasingly do so. So how many people will be displaced by climate change? This is really a question with no answer. Quantifying the current impact of climate change on human mobility is difficult for several reasons. The key challenge really is that climate change does not only act as a direct driver of migration, as we were seeing, but also influences a range of additional environmental, economic, social, demographic, and political drivers of migration. So it is really difficult to isolate climate change as a driver, as a factor. And in addition, there are more specific problems like the lack of reliable data due to logistical complexity of data collection and the methodological inconsistency that we find across jurisdictions. The fact that, at least for now, most movements happen over short distances and do not cross international borders, and therefore are more difficult to measure. And the almost complete lack of quantitative information on people displaced by slow onset processes. It's easier to count people on the move after a hurricane. It's much more difficult to count people who are displaced because of progressively reducing capacity of agricultural land, for example. Well, future predictions are even more difficult. Estimates by mid-century vary from tens of millions to hundreds of millions to 1 to 3 billion people. It is important to mention here that even in the really best case scenario, movements of this magnitude will have huge political and social impact, even in the best case scenario. If you think about the significant crisis that Europe has been going through since 2015, which includes Brexit and many other phenomena, such as a shift to the right in the political spectrum and so on, that crisis was the result of less than 5 million people moving into Europe. So even in best case scenarios, we should be ready to major impact. And also in other and maybe simpler words, what we can really say is that we have no idea. And these dramatic differences are in conceptualizations and definition of climate-related mobility and of different models and methodological approaches. In some cases, they also reflect simplistic and a bit deterministic understanding of the climate change and mobility nexus. What we do know is that the rapid onset climate-related crises are already displacing large number of people. In 2020, for example, 76% of the 40.5 million newly internally displaced people, so 30.7 million, have been forced to move by disasters, virtually all of which weather-related, even if not all directly attributable to climate change, of course, compared to 24% or less than 10 million displaced by conflict and violence. So more than 30 million versus 10 million. No matter how much uncertainty exists, there is little doubt that climate change will increasingly push people to migrate. What are the main mobility patterns? Even when migration can be directly attributed to the effects of climate change, a broad diversity of mobility patterns can be observed. At this time, most people, as I was saying, move within countries and on short distances, particularly when they are displaced by rapid onset emergencies. But that will definitely change once the cumulative effects of climate change increase. Often climate change-induced mobility translates into rural-urban migration. Most commonly, rural migrants settle in already overcrowded, marginalized, and underserved neighborhoods, offering very little in terms of services and job opportunities. Sometimes, like a good example being Bangladesh, they relocate to areas that are as exposed to environmental hazards as the areas of origin. It is also very important to emphasize that climate change does not always result in mobility. Slow onset processes in particular may work to limit movement opportunities instead of promoting them. People may not move at all despite deteriorating conditions for different reasons. In some cases, they lack the financial resources, knowledge, and social support networks essential to relocation. These groups, for the most part vulnerable and disenfranchised, are often known as trapped populations. In other cases, people maybe choose to stay even when long-term adaptation prospects are not particularly good. Sometimes because the relationship between people and their land is so central to human identity that they are afraid of losing their culture and tradition by moving and prefer to face additional challenges, but continue to live on the land of their ancestors. And sometimes because the risk perception can be partial and misleading. And finally, in other cases, factors such as perverse incentives created by policy interventions or access to remittances from family members who have previously migrated may convince people to stay even when long-term adaptation options are minimal or non-existent. And this is a decision that can have dramatic health consequences. So what should be done? And I want to emphasize that over the next couple of slides that are the final two, I will be referring exclusively to the climate change migration nexus and not to how to respond to climate change in general. Also, most of my observations are based on personal knowledge of the work done by international organizations and on direct experience collaborating with some of them. I will not mention specific organizations nor use specific examples because I think that most of these issues are quite general. What I can say is that I'm facing the same kind of dilemma that many other academics collaborating with international organizations have faced in the past. On the one hand, I realize that international organizations, beyond the technical facade that they have, are fundamentally complex political organizations. Not all of their work solves the problems, and in some cases, it can actually make it worse. On the other hand, I think it is important to engage in an open and critical discussion of these issues. Ways, I'm happy to do that. Critical research implies what Jennifer Hinman calls duplicity, that is the combination of participation in international organizations' work and the independent criticism of their activities. So regarding what should be done, first, mitigation remains a fundamental goal, as the virtually linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and global warming could result in conditions that would make all other considerations and intervention futile. While improving data collection and fine-tuning analytical methods and developing more advanced models are all essential goals to expand our understanding of the links between climate change and human mobility, it is swift action toward mitigation that is most urgently needed, as every single IPCC report tells us. Knowledge generation should never become an end in itself, a fixation and an excuse not to act, which is unfortunately often, I would say, a problem in academia. Second, similarly to most other drivers of migration, climate change impacts different population groups differently, as I was mentioning earlier, disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. And therefore, both short and long-term responses to climate change-related mobility should be informed by principles of justice and equity. Third, the continuum between climate change-related migration and displacement and the lack of a clear demarcation line should result in actions to protect people who fall outside of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Fourth, while it is important to avoid the deterministic characterizations of the climate change human mobility nexus, and the potential overestimated predictions often associated to them, it is equally important to avoid an equally simplistic approach to the problem that would lead to significantly underestimating the real impact of this phenomenon on the planet. Climate change is not happening in isolation, as we saw, but in combination with other phenomena, the other dimension I listed in a previous slide. And all of these phenomena, all of these concurrent and interrelated crises require truly radical solutions. So I think personally that a worst case scenario approach should be when we develop policies and intervention in this particular area. And finally, while national plans and resources are definitely important, climate change and therefore climate change related mobility is by definition a global challenge. And it is therefore the international community that should take final responsibility to act, collaborate, and make additional financial and technical resources available. And that's actually what worries me the most. Will we ever be able to do that? So what is being done instead? There are a number of tensions that are evident. Often international organizations really emphasize the fact that statistics that exist in the literature or even in the general media and so on tend to overemphasize the impact, dramatize the impact that climate change is going to have. These organizations also tend to hide behind the challenge that isolating climate change as a specific driver of migration presents. At the end of the day, what they do really is the opposite. There is very little criticism of minimizing actually what this impact could be. When it comes to mitigation versus adaptation, it is actually quite difficult in most cases to even include the word mitigation, if not on the margin, in official documents, because as you all understand, mitigating truly means, it would truly mean rethinking radically our model of development and what we mean with sustainability and what we don't. I mean, the history of goals in global health, going all the way from Alma Ata to the Sustainable Development Goals, is an history of goals whose pivoting point, the way of understanding development was economic growth. And it is quite obvious that continuing economic growth, infinite growth, and the planet don't get along very well. So the emphasis tends to be more on adaptation, and I'll mention something more in a second. Language issues. There are contradictions, for example, in the analysis made by different international organizations. So I've seen at the same time, maybe two reports published. One of them would somehow minimize the impact of climate change on displacement, while the other one would actually present shocking projections related, for example, to sea level increases and salinization of agricultural land. Let's not forget that 1/3 of the world population lives less than 100 kilometers from a shoreline and at low altitude, or access to water and food. And again, 1/6 of the human population depends on glaciers for water. And we know what's happening to glaciers. So these are phenomena of enormous proportions that should really be central to our reaction and our interventions in terms of climate change. Another issue that I have noticed is that often the impact of climate change is somehow oversimplified. And I think that there is a lot of literature, literature emphasizing the complexity of this phenomenon, and even articles that discuss the fact that even expert people who spend their whole life working on climate change don't really understand wholly the phenomenon. There are always parts, dynamics, mechanism that they don't completely understand because of the complexity of this phenomenon. And often what I have seen are people who maybe with good intention, but not a lot of information, when they talk about the impact of climate change, they talk about the essential elements or examples that I mentioned before in terms of short and long-term effects. What I am doing right now with a group of collaborators, so we are reviewing the literature that brings together climate change, displacement, and food security. So these are important dimensions, but they don't cover the entire field, of course, and realizing the complexity of this mechanism, which is surprising, really. Also, something that often is not taken into consideration in the official discourse are tipping points and thresholds. They are usually ignored, including the ice collapse, the capacity of the ocean to regulate temperature and capturing CO2, plus obviously the potential for a generalized collapse of the marine environment and life. The collapse of marine water circulation movements. There are actually data showing that the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, so the circulation that brings warm water from the Gulf to Northern Europe might be close to collapsing. And if that happens, of course, the impact that it's going to have on an entire continent and potentially the entire Earth climate would be devastating. Thawing of the permafrost, feedback loops related to wildfire and so on. There are so many examples of these tipping point and thresholds. And we tend to be very bad at envisioning that because of the way our brain really works. The language used in many of these reports is often kind of removed from reality, in my opinion. Things like moving with dignity, choosing to relocate, human rights, and so on, they are all important things, but they're often used to describe that are extreme and goals that were difficult to achieve even before climate change became a major issue. And again, on language, there would be a lot more to say. I realize that it's 1 p.m. I don't know, David, whether we have a bit more time or not. And you're on mute.
If there are any questions, please feel free to ask them to Andrea. He can stay for a few more minutes.
Yeah, I'm pretty much done. So.
Okay, that was excellent, Andrea. Thank you so very much. You brought so many different aspects together, and the history and the underlying assumptions and so many different things. Thank you very much. It was extremely enlightening.
Thank you.
I'll just ask you quickly, because so much of what our world is premised on is, as you mentioned, is on colonialism. And we often think of that as the colonialism of Western Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, or even earlier. But so much of the history of humankind is based on colonialism too, isn't it? I mean, there was the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Chinese Empire, and various others that wanted to create empires. Even the Aztecs in Mexico, and the Mayans and others. So that just seems to be kind of built into the human situation, the quest for more land, for overtaking other people's area to extract resources, use their labor, whatever.
Yeah, so the issue of what is human nature and what is not is very, very delicate, as we know, and we tend to look at the whole from our perspective as Westerners, right? And there are a lot of traditional cultures that have completely different, use completely different parameters. And this is not, and I'll stop sharing because we don't need it anymore, but, and this is not, you know, romanticizing in indigenous cultures and societies or the history before the beginning of Western colonialism. But this is to say that we are everything and the opposite of everything, depending on what we are taught and the system of incentives that are in place and so on. And the big difference that I see also between the empire today and empire in the past is the kind of global impact it has and the significance of that impact and the fact that it works in parallel with other really dangerous phenomena or ways of understanding the world, such as the myth of infinite growth. One thing that I try to show my students is how a lot of the things that we consider natural, like a given, there is a lot of tendency to naturalize things in global health, poverty being one. They're very recent, like this concept, economic growth as a policy goal didn't even show up on the agenda until after World War II. So these are really, really recent phenomena and ways of understanding reality that I think is important to know about this, because I would say knowing that these are recent ways of doing things also shows that there is a chance, a possibility of changing things.
Yeah. I think too, what's intertwined to a lot of that, though, it also is the continual population growth and the challenges that brings on so many different levels.
Even if we know that we have the resources to feed about 10 billion people, and the fact that so many people don't have access to food is not about the numbers, but it is about inequities, and also the fact that once equity is at work, people tend to have less incentives to have a larger number of children. That's quite.
But that also feeds into the need for economic growth to provide jobs and that sort of thing, and also the use of the world's resources. We know that we're already using too many of the world's resources, and even though most of the population growth is in areas of low resource use, it still is adding on every day to the catastrophe looming. Yeah.
Yes, and
yeah, lots of
jobs are nothing bad. It depends on what kind of jobs and resources. There are many different types of resources and many different ways of using them.
Mm-hmm.
Vic, nice to see you.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi.
David, I'll jump in. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So after several decades, Andrea, so we have a new organization in Canada, as you know, within which this working group on climate change and health is chugging away. David is the co-chair. If there were one or two priorities for this group related to climate change, migration, and health, what comes to mind about that? I mean, for example, is there some kind of a Canadian network of colleagues like yourself doing work that we could collaborate with, just as an example?
Yeah, so I want to reemphasize I come from the migration piece and not really the climate change one. So I'm probably not the best person to ask these questions to, but like or other colleagues they would have a lot of information on these things. There are definitely networks that that can be considered. And in terms of key contributions, I think it's really encouraging a conversation, a debate that does not exclude anything. Because I'm very, you know, we are all ideological, obviously, including myself, obviously, and I don't deny that we are all ideological. But I think that to find a solution to these issues, we have to go beyond ideology. Otherwise, we risk getting stuck there, not going anywhere. And unfortunately, we have very little time.
That's a very important observation, because we have to learn to be able to maybe understand or accept things that we're not comfortable with.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, if it goes against our ideology, like.
So I use a lot the word radical, which has been a little bit mistreated over the past couple of decades. But radical simply, as you know, means close to the roots. We do have to look at the roots of things. We have to understand really where we are coming from and how things are working if we want to change them. And I don't remember who was the one person who said, it's actually easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? And I know that even using the word capital, if you think about the 2008 WHO report on social determinants of health, not once in the entire report that the word capitalism is there. And I can only, having been part of a similar commission recently, I can only imagine the conversations that went on there. But definitely it's a word that is very divisive. Somebody, a Canadian, and unfortunately, because of my early Alzheimer, I don't remember the name, but I can find it. In a lecture he gave a few months ago, say something that was actually quite interesting, because somebody asked him, so do you think that this means the end of capitalism? And he say, I don't know, and I don't care, in the sense that capitalism, you know, the system that is in place could change so much not to be described any longer as capitalism. Or maybe we could still call it whatever, capitalism 2.0, whatever we want to call it, but it would be a fundamentally different system from the one that we have experienced over the past 100 years, let's say. And that, because I think obviously we need to avoid as much as possible polarizations and positions that are acritical. And so certain language doesn't help. At the same time, we do have to discuss things that are very uncomfortable.
Great, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Andrea. I think everybody else has signed off, but yeah, good to see you. Thank you so much. That was really great. Thanks, Janine, for doing all the technical work. Very appreciated.
Nice to see you, Vic and David. Very nice.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye now.
See you later. Thanks, Vic.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.